Hello, my name is Cecil Reyes, and I am a just graduated senior with a major in fine arts and a double concentration in studio and art history. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about my paper, The Lasting Effects of Colonialism and Westernization on Gender and Sexuality. Now, in my paper, I talk about how historically the institutions of colonialism, Christianity brought over by colonialism, and slavery have heavily impacted the representations of gender and sexuality of the First Nations people of Canada and the Black people of the United States. I researched 4 artists, two First Nations, Two-Spirit artists from Canada, and two Black artists from the United States. The first artist that I'll be talking a little bit about is Raven John, who uses they, them pronouns. They are a Two-Spirit artist from the Coast Salish and Stolo territories of Canada. And I looked at their 2017 painting, Two-Spirit Transformation Blessing. In my research that I did about them, I learned that a lot of their paintings and pieces, including their Two-Spirit piece, has to do with their Two-Spirit gender identity. They talk about how their work breaks the colonial narrative and the colonial stereotypes surrounding the strict duality, one or the other, the masculine or the feminine, and the colonial lines that define gender. And they talk about how their Two-Spirit identity isn't just one settled thing. It doesn't have a fixed gender or sexuality, and how much of an importance it has to them. And this importance kind of leads me to my next artist that I talked about in my paper, Ayren Stimson, who uses he, him pronouns, who is also a Two-Spirit artist from Canada, from the Blackfoot or Siksika Nation. And Ayren Stimson uses his Buffalo Boy persona, which how he calls it, the gay cowboy meets Native American meets Buffalo. In my research, I learned that his Buffalo Boy persona pops up in a lot of his pieces, including the one that I talked about in my paper, his 2005 recreation photo, Sketches from Indian Life. In this recreation photo, he recreates this scene of children in a residential school. And residential schools in Canada were these places where Native American children were forced to go to, and they had to adhere to these very Eurocentric standards, which in turn erased their own identities, their own cultural identities. Ayren Stimson, being Two-Spirit, had his own identity erased when he had to go to a residential school, and I talk more about that in my paper and about his recreation photos. The next two artists that I talked about in my paper are the two Black artists. First one being Grace Jones, who uses she, her pronouns, and I looked at her one-man show performance. In her one-man show performance, and unlike the other artists who use more traditional means to express their works, she actually uses her own body, her own appearance, as she's a singer and songwriter and performer. In her one-man show, she breaks the stereotypes surrounding Black identity, about Black people being primitive, as she uses traditional tribal clothes and tribal accessories, and paints herself in tribal patterns, and also breaks the gender roles, gender boxes, and the way she moves throughout her performance. And then another artist that I talked about is John Edmonds, who uses he, him pronouns, and I looked at his 2018 photograph, The Villain. Similar to how Grace Jones breaks stereotypes surrounding the Black identity, John Edmonds does this through his work. His work primarily explores the identity of being Black, the role of identity itself, what it means to be Black in today's day, in today's America. And his 2018 photo, The Villain, subverts stereotypes, flips them on its head. He uses his photo to subvert the stereotype that Black people are associated with gang violence, or the stereotype of the Black thug. He uses his photo to explore the themes of intimacy and masculinity, very specifically in this one. And that's a little bit about my paper. Thank you for listening, and I hope you give it a read. Have a great day.
Hi, I'm Alison Dombrowsky. I'm a CNU graduate of 2020, and my major was in art history, and my minor was in classical studies. So for my senior seminar in art history, I did a paper on different female artists in the Baroque period, and I was focusing on how they portray each of the mythology, biblical scenes, and self-portraiture different than the males of the period did. And then I was comparing 3 specific artists to each other, because each of them are 3 female artists, and those are who I focused on in my paper. So the title of my paper was Female Artist Perspective in the Baroque Period, and my specific thesis was Gentileschi, Serrani, and Fontana all used their painting skills to express themselves, which ended up in their challenging the norms of both self-portraiture and biblical scenes. So I was focusing in the Baroque period, which is the 1600 to 1750, and seeing how the resurgence of Catholicism and Christianity in art, and how these women each portrayed it differently, but also the use of self-portraiture to prove how successful these women were, which was unusual for the time period because there wasn't very many successful women. And so the 3 I focused on were Lavinia Fontana, and her lifespan was 1552 to 1614. And then Artemisia Gentileschi, and she lived 1593 to 1659. And Elisabetta Serrani, who lived the shortest out of the 3, which was 1638 to 1665. And then I compared each of their self-portraits to one another to prove how they presented themselves as someone who's successful, and also use mythology to personify them each as an allegory of painting and showing their influence and talent and skill through these. And then I focused specifically on the subject of Judith, and in particular Judith slaying Holofernes, and how each of these female artists portrayed it differently than the males did, specifically focusing on the power of the women and then having challenged the typical tradition of how this imagery was painted. And I compared each of them to one another and showing how each of them had a different idea of how to do this. I did various studies on each of the paintings and scholarly writing, as well as seeing what they themselves had to say in their letters or various other primary sources, and then studying the paintings themselves, obviously. And in my conclusion, I had each of the artists, Lavinia, Artemisia, and Serrani, also managed to portray themselves in a less idealized way and created a more realistic standard for female portraits and for female heroes in the Bible. And this was created based upon each of their unique experiences and emotions, and is incredible considering the limitations placed upon women in Italy during their Baroque period. And so the other important thing is that they're all from Italy, different parts. And I also kind of did a brief thing of how each of them actually ended up influencing each other, whether directly or indirectly.
Hi, my name is Sarah Lovett. I'm an art history major with minors in museum studies and English literature. My senior seminar topic was how Russia used law to make art theft legal, using Russia's history of art theft as a case study. My thesis for this paper was that using Russia as a case study, I would examine the motivations of and reactions to art theft. Art theft in Russia will be compared to Nazi Germany and Egypt, since they are 2 other countries where large amounts of looting and art theft have occurred. Each situation is different and has been handled differently, and this study will illuminate lesser-known examples while examining the reasons for these differences and what is being done to resolve the problem of art theft. Throughout the paper, I defined what art theft was according to the FBI and Interpol, and then discussed what the 3 different forms of art theft there are and how they apply to each situation. The first form is during wars, the second is the taking through archaeological digs, and the third is the taking from a museum or a private owner. By assigning one of these forms to each situation, it is then easy to see how Russia's history with art theft differs from Germany and Egypt, as they are not just one form, but they are a combination of all three major forms of art theft. They have works stolen from them, they stole works, and now they are refusing to return them. Russia's complicated history with stolen art starts with the Nazi invasion of Soviet Russia in 1941. When the Nazis invaded Russia, they made their bases in many of the museums that then had to be abandoned, which accounts for the loss of many artworks. Russia also lost 14% of its population during the Nazi invasion and therefore decided to retaliate by forming trophy brigades that were secretly established in 1945. They then began looting on a broad scale towards the end of the war. This stolen art was hidden in museums, allowing for them to become government property, which would later protect them in the eyes of the Russians. In 1998, Russia mandated a law that favored naturalization over return to their homelands for stolen artworks. They then made repatriation even harder by enacting another law stating that if any works were taken privately, but the government is now in control of the works, they are now government property. One of the main reasons most of these laws against repatriation are still in place is due to public support. Russians felt that they were owed these trophies for compensation after all they had lost during World War II. In conclusion, using Russia as a study for stolen art and repatriation offers an ethical debate for art historians. It is not as clear-cut as the looting that occurred in Egypt or the looting the Nazis themselves did. It leaves the question, would you be willing to return these works if your country was as devastated as Russia was? Thank you.
Hello, this is Ayren Martin, and I am going to present my senior seminar paper presentation, The Influence of Sex on Art. I have a quote from an Italian author. Why should I be ashamed to describe what nature was not ashamed to create? So, my thesis is I will compare how history, individual psychology, sexuality, and more recently, pornography have profoundly influenced four artists. These artists are from two different countries working decades apart. From Japan, you have Takashi Murakami. He was born in 1962. Also from Japan, you have Yayoi Kusama, who was born in 1929. And then from the United States of America, you have Keith Haring, who was born in 1958, died in 1990, and Marilyn Minter, who was born in 1948. To them, art is sexuality, and sexuality is art. In summary, in Marilyn Minter and Keith Haring and Kusama and Takashi Murakami's works, they reveal how sex and sexuality isn't influence their works. You can see how their personal interest or sexual experience, the good and the bad, shape their art. And in one case, you can see how mental illness played a role in her battle to overcome her fear of sex and sexuality. And finally, these wildly creative artists reflect their views of sexuality in respect to their respective cultures, Japan and America. These artists are showcasing the expression of sex and sexuality and hitting home the points that sex and sexuality are still a driving force for the good and the bad in our world and our art.